The Wall, a work by Jean-Paul Sartre. They threw us into a large white room, and my eyes blinked because the light hurt them. Then I saw a table and 4 men behind it, some civilians, looking at papers. They had gathered the other prisoners at the back, and we had to cross the entire room to join them. There were many people I knew, and others who must have been foreigners. The 2 in front of me were blonde with round heads. They looked alike. French, I thought. The shorter one kept pulling up his pants. He was nervous. This lasted for about 3 hours. I was dazed. My head was empty, but the room was well heated, which felt very pleasant. We had been shivering nonstop for 24 hours. The guards brought the prisoners one by one before the table. The 4 men would then ask for their name and profession. Most of the time, they didn't go any further, or sometimes they would ask a single question. Did you take part in the sabotage of the ammunition? Or, where were you and what were you doing on the morning of the 9th? They didn't seem to listen to the answers, or at least they acted like they weren't listening. They would fall silent for a moment, staring ahead, and then start writing. They asked Tom if it was true that he served in the International Brigade. Tom couldn't deny it because of the papers they had found in his clothes. They didn't ask Juan anything, but as soon as he said his name, they wrote for a long time. "It's my brother Jose who is an anarchist," said Juan. "You know he's not here. I don't belong to any party. I've never been involved in politics." They didn't reply. Juan added, "I haven't done anything. I don't want to pay for others." His lips were trembling. A guard silenced him and took him away. Then it was my turn. "Are you Pablo Ibbieta?" I said yes. The man looked at his papers and asked me, "Where is Ramon Gris?" "I don't know. You hid him in your house from the 6th to the 19th. "No." They wrote for a moment, and the guards took me out. In the hallway, Tom and Juan were waiting between 2 guards. We started walking. Tom asked one of the guards, "And now?" "What?" said the guard. "Was that an interrogation or a trial?" "That was the trial," said the guard. "Well, what are they going to do with us?" The guard replied curtly, "You will be informed of the sentence in the cell." In reality, what served as our cell was one of the hospital's basements. The cold was terrible because of the drafts. We had shivered all night, and the day hadn't been much better. The 5 previous days, I had been in a dungeon at the Archbishop's palace, a kind of underground chamber that must have dated back to the Middle Ages. Since there were too many prisoners and not enough space, they put us anywhere they could. I didn't miss my dungeon. I hadn't suffered from the cold there, but I had been alone, which gets irritating after a while. In the basement, I had company. Juan barely spoke. He was scared, and besides, he was too young to have much to say. But Tom was a good talker and spoke Spanish very well. In the underground room, there was a bench and 4 straw mattresses. When they brought us back, we sat together and waited in silence. After a moment, Tom said, "We're done for." "That's what I think too," I said. "But I don't think they'll do anything to the kid." "They have nothing against him," said Tom. "He's just the brother of a militant, that's all." I looked at Juan. He didn't seem to understand. Tom continued, "Do you know what they do in Zaragoza? They lay people down on the road and run trucks over them. A Moroccan deserter told us. They say it's to save ammunition." "That doesn't save fuel," I said. I was annoyed with Tom. He shouldn't have said that. "Some officers walk along the road," he went on, "watching with their hands in their pockets, smoking cigarettes. Do you think they finish them off? You're wrong. They let them scream. Sometimes for an hour. The Moroccan said that, the first time, he almost threw up." "I don't think they do that," I said, "unless they're really out of ammunition." Light entered through 4 vents and a round opening in the ceiling on the left. which opened to the sky. This round hole, usually covered by a trap door, was used to pour coal into the basement. Right beneath the hole was a large pile of coal dust meant to heat the hospital, but since the war began, the patients had been evacuated, and the coal had remained there, unused. Sometimes it got rained on because they had forgotten to close the trap door. Tom started shivering. "Damn it, I'm shivering again," he said. "Here we go again." He got up and began exercising. With each movement, his shirt opened over his broad, hairy chest. He lay on his back, lifted his legs, and did scissor kicks in the air. I could see his thick buttocks trembling. Tom was big, but he had too much fat. I thought that soon rifle bullets or bayonet tips would sink into that soft flesh like a knife into butter. It didn't affect me the same way it would if he had been thin. I wasn't exactly cold, but I couldn't feel my back or arms. From time to time, I had the impression that something was missing, and I started looking around for my jacket. Then, suddenly, I would remember that they hadn't given it back to me. It was very annoying. They had taken our suits to give them to their soldiers and left us only our shirts and those thin fabric pants that hospital patients wear in the middle of summer. After a while, Tom got up and sat down next to me, panting. "Did you warm up?" "No, damn it. But now, I'm overheated." Around 8 o'clock at night, a commander entered with 2 phalangists. He had a sheet of paper in his hand. He asked the guard, "What are these 3 called?" "Steinbach, Ibbieta, and Myrbal," said the guard. The commander put on his glasses and looked at the list. "Steinbach, Steinbach. Here it is. You are sentenced to death. You will be executed tomorrow morning." He looked again. "The other 2 as well," he said. "That's not possible," said Juan. "Not me." The commander looked at him, surprised. "What's your name?" "Juan Myrbal." "Well, your name is here," said the commander. "You are sentenced." "I haven't done anything," said Juan. The commander shrugged and turned toward Tom and me. "Are you Basques?" "None of us are Basque." He looked irritated. "I was told there were 3 Basques. I'm not going to waste my time chasing after them. So, naturally, you don't want a priest?" We didn't respond. He said, "A Belgian doctor will be here shortly. He has permission to spend the night with you." He gave a military salute and left. "What did I tell you?" Tom exclaimed. "We're done for." "Yeah," I said. "It's stupid for the kid." I said it to be fair, but I didn't like the kid. His face was too delicate, and fear and suffering had disfigured him, twisting all his features. 3 days ago, he had been a fine-looking boy. Some might find that appealing. But now he looked like an old hag, and I thought he would never be young again, even if they set him free. It wouldn't have been bad to offer him some pity, but pity disgusted me. In fact, it horrified me. He hadn't said anything else, but he had turned gray. His face and hands were gray. He sat down again, staring at the ground with wide-open eyes. Tom was a good soul. He tried to take the boy's arm, but the kid pulled away violently, making a grimace. "Leave him," I said in a low voice. "You can see he's about to start crying." Tom reluctantly obeyed. He had wanted to comfort the boy. It would have kept him occupied and distracted him from thinking about himself. But that irritated me. I had never thought about death because I had never had the occasion to. But now the occasion was here, and there was no choice but to think about it. Tom started talking. "Have you taken out any guys?" he asked me. I didn't answer. He began explaining that he had taken out 6 since the beginning of August. He wasn't grasping the situation, and I could see clearly that he didn't want to. I myself wasn't fully grasping it yet either. I wondered if it would hurt much, thought about the bullets, imagined their burning hail piercing my body. All of that was beside the real point. I was calm. We had all night to understand. After a while, Tom stopped talking, and I glanced at him from the corner of my eye. I saw that he too had turned gray and looked miserable. I thought, it's starting. It was almost night. A soft light filtered through the vents, and the pile of coal formed a large dark patch under the sky. Through the hole in the ceiling, I could already see a star. The night would be clear and freezing. The door opened, and two guards entered. They were followed by a blond man in a light brown uniform. He greeted us. "I'm a doctor," he said. "I have permission to assist you in these difficult circumstances." He had a pleasant, distinguished voice. I said, "What are you doing here?" "I am at your disposal. I will do everything I can to make these hours less difficult for you." "Why did they send you to us?" "There are other people. The hospital is full." "I was assigned here," he replied vaguely. "Ah, you'd like a smoke, wouldn't you?" he added hastily. "I have cigarettes, even cigars." He offered us English cigarettes and some cigars, but we refused. I looked him in the eyes, and he seemed uncomfortable. I said, "You're not here out of compassion. Besides, I know you. I saw you with some fascists in the courtyard of the barracks the day I was arrested." I was about to continue, but suddenly something surprising happened. The doctor's presence stopped, interesting me entirely. Usually, when I confront a man, I don't let up. Yet, the desire to speak left me. I shrugged and looked away. A little later, I raised my head. He was watching me with curiosity. The guards had sat down on a mattress. Pedro, tall and thin, was twiddling his thumbs. The other one occasionally shook his head to keep himself from falling asleep. "Do you want some light?" Pedro suddenly asked the doctor. The other man nodded. I thought he had no more intelligence than a log, but he was certainly not mean-spirited. Looking into his large, cold blue eyes, it seemed to me that his greatest flaw was a lack of imagination. Pedro left and returned with a kerosene lamp, which he placed in the corner of the bench. It gave off a weak light, but it was better than nothing. On the previous night, they had left us in the dark. I stared for a long time at the circle of light the lamp cast on the ceiling. I was mesmerized. Then, suddenly, I snapped out of it. The circle of light vanished, and I felt crushed beneath an enormous fist. It wasn't the thought of death or fear. It was something anonymous. My cheekbones burned, and my skull ached. I shook myself and looked at my two companions. Tom had his head buried in his hands. I could only see his thick, white neck. The young Juan was undoubtedly in the worst shape. His mouth hung open, and his nose trembled. The doctor moved closer to him and placed a hand on his shoulder, as if to comfort him, but his eyes remained cold. Then I saw the Belgian's hand subtly slide down Juan's arm until it reached his wrist. Juan let him do it indifferently. The Belgian took his wrist with 3 fingers, absent-mindedly, while at the same time stepping back slightly, positioning himself so that his back was to me. But I leaned back and saw him take out his watch, glancing at it for a moment without letting go of the boy's wrist. After a moment, he let the limp hand drop and went to lean against the wall. Then, as if suddenly remembering something urgent that needed to be noted immediately, he pulled a notebook from his pocket and wrote a few lines. "The bastard," I thought angrily. "If he tries to take my pulse, I'll smash my fist into his filthy mouth." He didn't come over, but I could feel him looking at me. He spoke in an impersonal tone. "Don't you think it's chilly in here?" He seemed cold. His face was turning violet. "I'm not cold," I replied. He kept staring at me, his gaze hard. Suddenly, I understood. I brought my hands to my face. I was drenched in sweat. In that basement, in the middle of winter, in a draft, I was sweating. I ran my hands through my hair, which was soaked in perspiration. At the same time, I realized that my shirt was damp and clinging to my skin. I had been dripping with sweat for at least an hour and hadn't noticed. But that Belgian pig had seen it. He had watched the drops rolling down my cheeks and had thought, This is a manifestation of a nearly pathological state of terror. And he had felt normal, even proud of himself, because he was cold. I wanted to stand up and smash his face, but as soon as I made the slightest movement, my shame and anger disappeared. I slumped back onto the bench with indifference. I simply wiped my neck with my handkerchief because now I could feel the sweat dripping from my hair onto my nape, and it was unpleasant. But soon, I gave up on wiping myself. It was pointless. My handkerchief was already soaked, and I kept sweating. I was even sweating on my buttocks, and my damp trousers stuck to the bench. Suddenly, young Juan spoke. "Are you a doctor?" "Yes," the Belgian replied. "Does it take long to suffer?" "Oh, when?" "Not at all," said the Belgian with a paternal voice, as if reassuring a patient in his office. "But they told me, sometimes it takes 2 volleys." "Sometimes," the Belgian admitted, lowering his head. "It can happen that the first volley doesn't hit any vital organs. So they have to reload the rifles and aim again." He thought about it and added, his voice hoarse, "That takes time." He was terribly afraid of suffering. It was all he could think about, typical for his age. I wasn't thinking much about that. It wasn't the fear of pain that made me sweat. I got up and walked toward the pile of coal. Tom flinched and shot me a resentful look. He was irritated because my shoes creaked. I wondered if my face was as ashen as his. I saw that he too was sweating. The sky was magnificent. No light reached this dark corner, and all I had to do was lift my head to see the Big Dipper. But it wasn't the same as before. The night before, in my cell at the Archbishop's palace, I could see a vast piece of sky, and each hour of the day had brought a different memory. In the morning, when the sky was a hard, clear blue, I thought of beaches along the Atlantic coast. At midday, when I saw the sun, I remembered a bar in Seville where I used to drink manzanilla while eating anchovies and olives. At noon, I would stay in the shade and think of the deep shadow stretching across half the sand while the other half sparkled in the sun. It was truly painful to see the entire earth reflected in the sky like that. But now, I could look up as much as I wanted, and the sky evoked nothing. I preferred it this way. I went back to sit beside Tom. A long time passed. Tom began speaking in a low voice. He always needed to talk. Without it, he couldn't recognize his own thoughts. I think he was speaking to me, but he didn't look at me. He was probably afraid to see me as I was, gray and sweaty. We were alike, and that made us worse than mirrors for each other. He looked at the Belgian, the living one. "Do you understand?" he asked. "As for me, I don't understand." I also began speaking in a low voice, my eyes on the Belgian. "How? What is it? Something is going to happen to us, something I can't understand." There was a terrible smell around Tom. It seemed that my sense of smell had become more sensitive. I said ironically, "You'll understand in a moment. This isn't clear," he said stubbornly. "I want to be brave, but I need to at least know." "Listen, they're going to take us to the courtyard. Fine. The guys will line up in front of us. How many will there be? I don't know, 5 or 8, no more? Let's say 8. They'll shout, 'Aim,' and I'll see the 8 rifles pointed at me. I think I'll want to sink into the wall. I'll press my back against it with all my strength, and the wall will resist, just like in nightmares. I can imagine all that. Ah, if only you knew how vividly I can imagine it." "Come on," I said. "I can imagine it too." "It must hurt like hell. You know they aim for the eyes and mouth to disfigure you," he added maliciously. "I've already been feeling the wounds. For the past hour I've felt pain in my head and neck. Not real pain, it's worse. It's the pain I'll feel tomorrow morning. But after that—" I understood perfectly what he meant, but I didn't want to show it. As for the pain, I felt it in my body too, like 1,000 tiny stabs. There was nothing I could do, but since he felt the same, I didn't dwell on it. After that, I said harshly, "You'll swallow your tongue." He started talking to himself, never taking his eyes off the Belgian. The Belgian didn't seem to be listening. I knew why he was here. He wasn't interested in what we thought. He had come to observe our bodies, bodies that were dying while still in full health. It's like in nightmares, Tom said. You can think about anything, and you always feel like you're about to understand, but then it slips away. It escapes you, and you fall back again. I tell myself, after this, there's nothing. But I don't understand what I mean. Sometimes I almost grasp it, and then I fall back again, and I start thinking about the pain, the bullets, the gunshots. I'm a materialist, I swear to you. I'm not crazy, but something isn't right. I see my corpse. That's not hard. But it won't be me seeing it with my own eyes. I have to get to the point where I can think that I won't see anything anymore, that I won't hear anything anymore, and that the world will continue on for others. We're not made to think about that, Pablo. Believe me, I've spent entire nights waiting for something. But this is different. This will take us from behind, Pablo, and we won't have had time to prepare for it. Have courage, I said. Do you want me to call a priest? He didn't answer. I had already noticed his tendency to act like a prophet, calling me Pablo in that blank voice. I didn't like it much, but apparently all the Irish are like that. I had a vague impression that he smelled of urine. Deep down, I didn't have much sympathy for Tom, and I didn't see why, just because we were going to die together, I should suddenly start feeling it now. There were some people with whom it would have been different. Ramon Gris, for example. But between Tom and Juan, I felt alone. And in truth, I preferred it that way. With Ramon, I might have grown sentimental, but at that moment, I felt terribly hardened, and I wanted to stay that way. He kept chewing over his words with a kind of absent-mindedness. He was surely talking just to keep himself from thinking. He reeked of urine, like an old man with prostate trouble. Naturally, I agreed with him. Everything he said, I could have said myself. Dying isn't natural. And ever since I knew I was going to die, nothing had seemed natural anymore. Not that pile of coal, not the bench, not Pedro's filthy mouth. Only it annoyed me to be thinking the same things as Tom. And I knew that for the rest of the night, 5 minutes from now, we would still be thinking the same things at the same time, sweating and shuddering together. I glanced at him sideways, and for the first time, he seemed like a stranger to me. He had death on his face. It wounded my pride. For 24 hours I had lived beside Tom, listened to him, spoken to him, and I knew we had nothing in common. And now we were like identical twins, just because we were going to die together. Tom took my hand without looking at me. Pablo, I wonder if it's true that we are completely annihilated. I pulled my hand away and said, "Look between your feet, you filthy pig." There was a puddle between his feet, and a few drops were falling from his trousers. "What's that?" he asked, troubled. "You're pissing yourself." "It's not true," he said furiously. "I'm not pissing. I don't feel anything." The Belgian stepped closer and asked with false concern, "Are you feeling unwell?" Tom didn't answer. The Belgian looked at the puddle without saying anything. "I don't know what it is," Tom said sullenly. "But I'm not afraid. I swear I'm not afraid." The Belgian didn't respond. Tom stood up and went to urinate in a corner. He returned buttoning his fly, sat down, and said nothing. The Belgian was taking some notes. The three of us watched him because he was alive. He had the gestures of a living man, the concerns of a living man. He shivered in that cellar the way living people should shiver. He had a well-fed body that obeyed him. We barely felt our bodies, at least, not in the same way. I had the urge to feel my pants between my legs, but I didn't dare. I looked at the Belgian, hunched over his legs, master of his muscles, able to think about tomorrow. We were there, three bloodless shadows, watching him and drinking in his life like vampires. He eventually moved toward little Juan. Was he checking the nape of his neck for some professional reason? Or did he act out of charity? If it was charity, it was the only time he showed any all night. He stroked Juan's skull and neck. The boy let him do it, staring at him the whole time. Then suddenly, he took the Belgian's hand and looked at it strangely. He held the Belgian's hand between both of his own, and those two gray pincers clenching that thick, reddish hand were not at all pleasant. I suspected what was about to happen, and Tom must have suspected it too, but the Belgian didn't. He smiled paternally. After a moment, the boy lifted the thick, fleshy hand to his mouth and tried to bite it. The Belgian quickly pulled away and stumbled back against the wall. He looked at us in horror for a second. Suddenly, he must have realized that we were not men like him. I burst out laughing, and one of the guards flinched. The other had fallen asleep, his wide-open eyes showing only the whites. I felt both exhausted and overstimulated. I didn't want to think anymore about what would happen at dawn, about death. It didn't fit with anything. All I found were a few words and emptiness. But the moment I tried to think of something else, I saw rifle barrels aimed at me. Maybe 20 times I relived my execution. Once I even believed it was real. I must have dozed off for a minute. They were taking me to the wall, and I was struggling, begging for mercy. I woke up with a jolt and looked at the Belgian. I was afraid I had cried out in my sleep. But he was smoothing his mustache. He hadn't noticed anything. If I had wanted to, I think I could have slept for a moment. I'd been awake for 48 hours. I was exhausted. But I didn't want to lose 2 hours of life. They would wake me at dawn, and I would follow them in a daze, dying without even a groan. I didn't want that. I didn't want to die like an animal. I wanted to understand. I was also afraid of nightmares. I got up and started pacing back and forth, trying to distract myself by thinking about my past life. A flood of mixed memories came to me. Some were good, some bad, or at least that's what I used to call them. There were faces and stories. I saw again the face of a young bullfighter who had let himself be gored in Valencia, the face of one of my uncles, the face of Ramon Gris. I remembered some stories, how I had been unemployed for 3 months in 1926, how I had nearly died of hunger. I recalled a night I spent on a bench in Granada. I hadn't eaten in 3 days. I was furious. I didn't want to die. That made me smile. With what violence I had chased happiness, women, freedom. For what? I had wanted to liberate Spain. I admired P.Y. Margall. I joined the anarchist movement, spoke at public meetings. I took everything seriously, as if I were immortal. At that moment, I had the impression that my whole life was spread out before me, and I thought, it's a damn lie. Nothing mattered since it was all coming to an end. I wondered how I had ever strolled about, had fun with girls. I wouldn't have lifted a finger if I had known I would die like this. My life was there before me, finished, closed like a sack, and yet everything in it was incomplete. For a moment I tried to judge it. I wanted to tell myself, it was a good life. But there was no way to judge it. It was just a sketch. I had spent my time drawing a few lines for eternity without understanding anything. I hardly even regretted it. There were many things I could have missed. The taste of chamomile, the summer swims in a little cove near Cadiz. But death stripped everything of its charm. Then suddenly, the Belgian had a bright idea. "My friends," he said, "I can take care of it, if the military administration allows it, of delivering a word, a message, to the people you wish." Tom grunted. "I have no one." I said nothing. Tom waited a moment, then asked me curiously, Don't you have anything to say to Concha? No? I hated that tender complicity. It was my fault. The night before, I had spoken about Concha. I should have held back. I had been with her for a year. Just yesterday, I would have hacked off my own arm just to see her for 5 minutes. That's why I spoke about her. It was stronger than me. Now I didn't want to see her again. I had nothing more to say to her. I wouldn't have even wanted to hold her. I was horrified by my own body because it had turned gray and sweaty, and I wasn't sure I wouldn't feel the same horror toward hers. When she hears of my death, Concha will cry. For a few months, life will lose its flavor for her. But in the end, I was the one about to die. I thought about her beautiful, tender eyes. When she looked at me, something passed from her to me. I thought that was over now. If she looked at me now, her gaze would remain in her eyes. It wouldn't reach me. I was alone. Tom was alone too, but in a different way. He had straddled the bench and was staring at it with a kind of smile, looking surprised. He reached out his hand and cautiously touched the wood, as if afraid of breaking something, then quickly withdrew it and shuddered. If I were Tom, I wouldn't have amused myself by touching the bench. It was still part of his Irish theatrics. But I also found that objects looked strange. They were blurrier, less solid than usual. It was enough to look at the bench, the lamp, the pile of coal, to feel that I was going to die. Of course, I couldn't think clearly about my death, but I saw it everywhere. In things, in the way things had withdrawn and kept their distance, discreetly, like people speaking in hushed tones at the bedside of a dying man. It was his death that Tom had just touched on the bench. In the state I was in, if someone had come to tell me I could go home safely, that my life had been spared, I would have felt nothing. I had no one left. In a way, I was at peace. But it was a horrible kind of peace because of my body. My body, I saw through its eyes, heard through its ears. But it wasn't mine. It sweated and trembled on its own, and I didn't recognize it. I had to touch it, to look at it, to know what it was doing, as if it were someone else's body. At times, I could still feel it. Some shifts, some flips, like when a plane goes into a dive or the beat of my heart. But that didn't reassure me. Everything that came from my body seemed dirty and suspect. Most of the time, it was silent, still. I felt nothing but a kind of heaviness. A filthy presence stuck to me. I felt like I was tied to a giant worm. At one point, I groped at my trousers and felt that they were damp. I didn't know if it was sweat or urine, but just in case, I went to piss on the pile of coal. The Belgian took out his watch and looked at it. "It's 3:30, he said. Bastard! He must have done it on purpose. Tom jumped. Until now, we hadn't even realized that time was passing. The night surrounded us like a shapeless, shadowy mass. I couldn't even remember when it had begun. Little Juan started to scream. He wrung his hands, pleading, "I don't want to die. I don't want to die." He ran around the cellar, waving his arms in the air, then collapsed onto one of the mattresses and sobbed. Tom looked at him with dull eyes, not even moved to console him. Really, it wasn't worth it. The kid was making more noise than us, but he was less serious. He was like a sick man fighting off his illness with a fever. When there's not even a fever, that's when it's worse. He cried. I could see perfectly well that he felt sorry for himself. He wasn't thinking about death. For a second, just 1 second, I too wanted to cry, to weep for myself. But the opposite happened. I glanced at the boy, saw his thin, sobbing back, and felt inhuman. I couldn't feel pity. For him? For myself? I told myself, I want to die bravely. Tom stood up, positioned himself right under the round opening, and began waiting for the day. But more than anything, ever since the Belgian had told us the time, I could feel it slipping away, dripping drop by drop. It was still dark when I heard Tom's voice. "Do you hear them?" Yes, some men were marching in the courtyard. What are they up to? They can't shoot at night anyway. After a moment, we heard nothing more. I said to Tom, "Day is here." Pedro got up, yawning, and went to put out the lamp. He said to his companion, "It's freezing." The cellar was completely gray. We heard distant gunfire. "They've started," I said to Tom. "They must be doing it in the back courtyard." Tom asked the doctor for a cigarette, but I refused. I didn't want cigarettes or alcohol. From that moment on, the gunfire didn't stop. "Do you realize?" Tom said. He wanted to add something, but he fell silent. He was looking at the door. The door opened, and a sub-lieutenant entered with 4 soldiers. Tom dropped his cigarette. "Steinbach?" Tom didn't answer. It was Pedro who pointed him out. "Juan Mirbal? He's the one on the mattress." "Get up," said the sub-lieutenant. Juan didn't move. 2 soldiers grabbed him by the armpits and lifted him up, but as soon as they let go, he collapsed again. The soldiers hesitated. "He's not the first to feel sick," the sub-lieutenant said. "Just carry him between the 2 of you. They'll figure it out over there." He turned to Tom. "Come on, let's go." Tom walked out between 2 soldiers. Another 2 followed, carrying the boy by the armpits and the legs. When I tried to step forward, the sub-lieutenant stopped me. "Are you Ibbieta?" "Yes." "Wait here. They'll come for you soon." They left. The Belgian and the 2 guards left as well. I was alone. I didn't understand what was happening, but I would have preferred for them to finish it right away. I listened to the volleys at almost regular intervals. I shuddered at each one. I wanted to howl and tear my hair out, but I clenched my teeth and shoved my hands into my pockets because I wanted to stay calm. After an hour, they came for me and took me upstairs to a small room that smelled of cigars. The smell was suffocating. There were 2 officers sitting in armchairs, smoking, with a few papers on their laps. "Your name is Ibbieta?" "Yes." "Where is Ramon Gris?" "I don't know." The one questioning me was short and stout, with hard eyes behind his glasses. "Step closer," he said. I did. He stood up and grabbed me by the arms, staring at me as if he wanted to crush me into the ground. At the same time, he squeezed my biceps as hard as he could. He wasn't trying to hurt me. It was his big tactic, his way of trying to dominate me. And he made sure to breathe his foul breath right in my face. We stood like that for a moment. It almost made me want to laugh. It would take a lot more than that to intimidate a man about to die. It didn't matter anymore. He shoved me back roughly and sat down. "It's your life for his," he said. "Your life will be spared if you tell us where he is." These 2 men, with their whips and their boots, were also going to die. A little later than me, but not much later. They were busy looking for names in their little papers, chasing after other men to imprison or eliminate. They had opinions about the future of Spain and other matters. Their petty activities seemed ridiculous and absurd to me. I couldn't put myself in their place. They seemed insane. The short, fat man kept staring at me, slapping his boots with his whip. Every one of his movements was calculated to make him look like a living, ferocious beast. "Well? Do you understand?" "I don't know where Gris is," I replied. "I thought he was in Madrid." The other officer lazily raised his pale hand. This laziness, too, was calculated. I could see all their little maneuvers, and I was astonished that there were men who actually enjoyed such things. "You have 15 minutes to think it over," he said slowly. "Take him to the storeroom. Bring him back in 15 minutes. If he continues to deny it, he will be executed immediately." They knew what they were doing. I had spent the night waiting. Then they made me wait another hour in the basement while they shot Tom and Juan, and now they locked me in the storeroom. They must have planned it all the day before. They figured that nerves wear down over time and hoped to push me to that point. They were mistaken. In the storeroom, I sat down on a stool because I felt very weak and started to think, but not about their proposition. Of course, I knew where Grizz was. He was hiding at his cousin's house, 4 kilometers outside the city. I also knew that I wouldn't reveal his hiding place unless they tortured me, but they didn't even seem to consider that possibility. All of this was perfectly clear, settled, and of no interest to me. I only wanted to understand the reason for my actions. I would rather die than betray Grizz. But why? I no longer cared for Ramon Gris. My friendship for him had died just before dawn, at the same time as my love for Concha, at the same time as my desire to live. No doubt, I still respected him. He was strong. But that wasn't a reason to die in his place. His life was no more valuable than mine. No life had any value. A man was about to be put against a wall and shot until he collapsed. Whether it was me, Grizz, or someone else, it was all the same. I knew he was more useful to the cause of Spain than I was, but I didn't give a damn about Spain or anarchy. Nothing mattered anymore. And yet, there I was, able to save my own skin by giving up Grizz, and I refused to do it. I found that rather amusing. It was pure stubbornness. I thought, you really are a stubborn fool. And a strange joy came over me. They came for me and led me back to the 2 officers. A rat scurried away beneath our feet, and that amused me. I turned to one of the phalangists and said, "Did you see the rat?" He didn't answer. He was somber, taking everything so seriously. I felt like laughing but held back, afraid that if I started, I wouldn't be able to stop. The phalangist had a mustache. I said to him, "You should shave that off, dog." I found it odd that he allowed hair to take over his face like that. He gave me a half-hearted kick, and I fell silent. "Well," the fat officer said, "have you thought it over?" I looked at them with curiosity, like rare insects. I said, "I know where he is. He's hiding in the cemetery, in a crypt or the gravedigger's hut. I just wanted to mess with them. I wanted to see them jump up, tighten their belts, and bark orders in a frenzy. They leaped to their feet. 'Let's go. Moles, go ask Lieutenant Lopez for 15 men. Then the short, fat officer turned to me. "If you're telling the truth, I'm a man of my word. But if you've been mocking us, you'll pay for it dearly." They left noisily, and I waited calmly under the watch of the phalangists. I smiled now and then, thinking about the look on their faces. I felt numb and mischievous. I pictured them lifting tombstones, opening crypt doors one by one. I saw the whole situation as if I were an outsider. This prisoner stubbornly playing the hero, those serious phalangists with their mustaches, and their uniformed men running between graves. It was irresistibly comical. Half an hour later, the short, fat officer returned alone. I thought he was coming to give the order for my execution. The others must have stayed at the cemetery. The officer looked at me. He didn't seem upset at all. "Take him to the big courtyard with the others," he said. "Once military operations are over, an ordinary tribunal will decide his fate." I thought I had misheard. I asked, "So, they're not going to shoot me?" "Not for now. Later, it doesn't concern me." I still didn't understand. I said to him, "But why?" He shrugged without answering, and the soldiers took me away. In the large courtyard, there were 100 prisoners, women, children, and a few old men. I started walking around the central lawn feeling dazed. At noon, they gave us food in the refectory. 2 or 3 guys spoke to me. I must have known them, but I didn't answer. I didn't even know where I was. At dusk, a dozen new prisoners were thrown into the courtyard. I recognized Garcia, the baker. He said to me, "Damn lucky bastard. I never thought I'd see you alive again." "I was sentenced to death," I said, "and then they changed their minds. I don't know why." I was arrested 2 hours ago, Garcia said. Why? Garcia wasn't involved in politics. I don't know, he said. They arrest everyone who doesn't think like them. He lowered his voice. They got Grizz. I started trembling. When? This morning. He did something stupid. He left his cousin on Tuesday after they had a few words. There were plenty of people willing to hide him, but he didn't want to owe anything to anyone. He said, I would have hidden at Ibbieta's place, but since they took him, I'll go hide in the cemetery. In the cemetery? Yes. He was an idiot. Of course, they passed by there this morning. It was bound to happen. They found him in the gravedigger's hut. He fired at them, and they took him down. In the cemetery. Everything started spinning, and I found myself sitting on the ground, laughing so hard that my eyes filled with tears.